When I was 25, I took my first solo trip through Nevada. I know most people hear Nevada and immediately think of Las Vegas, casinos, bright lights, and bad decisions made at 3 a.m., but that wasn't the kind of trip I wanted. I had already done Vegas once with friends, and honestly, it drained me more than it entertained me. This time, I wanted desert roads, strange little towns, cheap motels, empty landscapes, and that eerie feeling you get when you're standing somewhere so quiet it almost feels like the world has been abandoned. I flew into Las Vegas, rented a car, and spent the first few days moving between the city, Red Rock Canyon, and some smaller desert stops. Everything went perfectly at first. The weather was brutal during the day, but beautiful at night. The roads were empty. The sky looked fake because of how many stars you could see once you got away from the strip. During the second half of the trip, I booked 3 nights at a small motel outside Beatty, not too far from the route toward Death Valley. It wasn't fancy at all. Just a low, one-story place with faded paint, old neon signage, and maybe 15 rooms arranged around a gravel parking lot. Behind the motel was nothing but desert. No houses. No stores. No real lights. Just scrub brush, sand, and mountains sitting black against the night sky. That was actually why I chose it. I wanted quiet. On my second day there, I drove around exploring ghost town areas and old mining roads. I stopped at a roadside diner around sunset, the kind of place where the waitress calls everyone honey, and the air smells like coffee, fryer oil, and dust. There were only a few people inside. I ate, drank 2 beers, and started driving back after dark. About halfway to the motel, I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. The highway was one long stretch through the desert. If someone else was going in the same direction, of course they'd be behind me for a while. But then I started testing it. When I slowed down, the car slowed down. When I sped up, it sped up. When I moved slightly onto the shoulder to let it pass, it stayed behind me. After a few miles, my stomach started tightening. I pulled into a gravel turnout and pretended to look at my phone. The car passed me slowly. It was an older dark SUV, maybe black or dark green. I couldn't see the driver clearly. For about 5 seconds, I felt stupid for being nervous. Then, maybe 100 yards ahead, the SUV pulled off the road too. It stopped. Just sat there. No hazard lights. No door opening. Nothing. It was waiting. I stayed in my car with both hands on the wheel, staring at those dark taillights. After maybe 30 seconds, I turned around and drove back in the opposite direction. I didn't know where else to go, so I drove until I found a gas station attached to a small casino. There were a few truckers outside smoking, and a clerk inside behind thick glass. I parked under the brightest light I could find and waited there for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe the SUV driver was lost. Maybe they were checking a map. Maybe I had watched too many horror movies. So I went back toward the motel. When I arrived, everything looked normal. The neon sign buzzed above the office. A couple of cars sat in the lot. My room was at the far end, away from the office, which I had thought was nice when I checked in. Now it just felt exposed. I locked the door, pushed the little chain latch into place, and went to bed. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I drove out early, took photos of the desert, and spent a few hours walking around a small historic mining area. Around noon, I stopped at a little outdoor market where a few tourists were buying water, snacks, and souvenirs. That's when I saw him. A man standing near the shade of an old gas pump. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just watching people. The only reason I noticed him was because he wore a dark jacket despite the heat. It was nearly 100 degrees. Nobody wears a heavy dark jacket in the Nevada desert at noon unless something is wrong. Then I remembered the driver from the night before. I had never seen his face, but I remembered the shape through the windshield. The stillness. The way the SUV had waited on the shoulder. I couldn't prove it was the same person. But I felt it. I left without buying anything. As I walked back to my rental car, I glanced behind me. The man was walking too. Not directly behind me. Not close enough to make a scene. Just far enough away that he could pretend he was headed somewhere else. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove straight back to the motel. I stayed in my room for most of the afternoon with the curtains closed. That evening, I went to the front office and told the woman working the desk what had happened. She listened politely, but I could tell she didn't really believe there was anything to worry about. She said strange people passed through the area all the time. She said tourists got nervous in the desert because everything felt isolated. She said if I saw him again, I should call the office. That would have made me feel better if the office stayed open all night. It didn't. They closed at 10. By the time I walked back to my room, I felt embarrassed. Out loud, the whole story sounded weak. A car followed me. A man stood near a market. A man walked behind me. That was it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went to bed around midnight. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. The room was completely dark except for a thin line of moonlight around the curtain. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps on gravel. Slow. Crunching. Right outside my room. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps stopped directly outside my window. My room was on the ground floor, and the window faced the back of the motel, toward the empty desert. There was no sidewalk back there. No reason for another guest to be walking around that side of the building in the middle of the night. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Then I heard the door handle move. Not violently. Not like someone trying to break in. It turned slowly. Carefully. Like whoever was outside was trying not to make noise. The handle reached the end of its turn, stopped against the lock, and eased back into place. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. A few seconds later, it happened again. This time harder. The chain latch rattled softly. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed my phone and called the motel office. Nobody answered. Of course nobody answered. The office had closed hours ago, and suddenly I understood how alone I really was. The footsteps moved away from the door. For one stupid moment, I tried to convince myself it was a drunk guest at the wrong room. Maybe someone had stumbled around from the parking lot, confused by the identical doors. But then the footsteps returned to the window. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I needed to prove to myself there was someone there. Maybe I thought seeing nothing would calm me down. I slowly got out of bed, crouched low, and moved toward the curtain. I pulled one tiny corner back. A man was crouched directly beneath the window. He was looking up at me. Not standing nearby. Not passing through. Crouched. Waiting. The second he saw the curtain move, he rose to his feet and ran into the darkness behind the motel. I dropped the curtain and backed away so fast I nearly tripped over my own bag. For a few seconds I just stood there frozen. Then I grabbed the desk chair, wedged it under the door handle, took my backpack and phone into the bathroom, locked that door too, and sat on the floor with the lights off until sunrise. I didn't sleep. Every sound outside felt like him coming back. Every passing truck on the highway made me flinch. When the sky finally turned gray, I waited until I heard the first housekeeping cart roll across the parking lot. Only then did I leave the bathroom. The motel owner arrived around 7. I went straight to the office and told him everything. At first, I expected the same polite disbelief I'd gotten from the woman the night before. But he didn't look skeptical. He looked worried. He asked me to describe the man. Dark jacket. Medium height. Thin build. Baseball cap pulled low. I hadn't seen much more than that, but apparently it was enough. The owner unlocked his phone, scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward me. It was a photo taken from a security camera. Same dark jacket. Same cap. Same hunched posture. My stomach dropped. That's him, I said. The owner sighed and told me the man wasn't a guest. He said businesses around Beatty and along the highway had reported him before. He would follow tourists, especially people traveling alone, sometimes for hours. Sometimes he showed up again the next day. Sometimes he disappeared for weeks. Nobody knew exactly what he wanted. He had been questioned before, but he always had some excuse. Lost. Out walking. Looking for someone. Waiting for a ride. The owner said police couldn't do much unless he actually broke in or threatened someone. I packed immediately. The owner helped me arrange a room at a larger hotel closer to Las Vegas and told me not to stop anywhere isolated. I wanted to believe leaving that motel would end it. It didn't. About 2 hours into the drive, I stopped at a convenience store outside Pahrump to buy water and gas up the rental. While I was paying, something made me look through the front window. Across the road, under the shade of a dead-looking tree, was the same dark SUV. The driver's window was down. A man in a dark jacket sat behind the wheel, facing the store. I went cold. He had followed me. Again. The moment I stared long enough to recognize him, the SUV started. It pulled away slowly at first, then disappeared down the highway. I stayed inside the store and told the clerk what was happening. He walked out with me while I got back into my car, and I called the hotel in Las Vegas before leaving so someone would know I was on my way. I never saw the SUV again. I still don't know what that man wanted from me. Maybe he planned to rob me. Maybe he wanted to break into the room. Maybe he just liked watching people become afraid. That's almost the worst part. There was never an explanation. Just a man in the desert who somehow found my motel, stood outside my room at 2 in the morning, tried my door, crouched under my window, and then followed me across the state like he had nothing better to do. I've traveled alone since then. I've stayed in strange places. I've driven empty roads. But nothing has ever matched the feeling of pulling back that curtain and seeing someone crouched there in the dark, looking up at me from beneath a motel window in the middle of the Nevada desert. When I was 17, my high school organized a 5-day trip to Reno, Nevada. Most people probably wouldn't think of Reno as the most exciting destination for a school trip, but it was part of an exchange program with another school, and our teachers packed the schedule with museums, historical sites, and college visits around northern Nevada. Honestly, I enjoyed it. I had 3 close friends with me, we stayed in a decent hotel downtown, and during the day there was always something planned. The only problem was that I've never liked following schedules. I've always been the type of person who wants to wander off, explore side streets, and see what a city is really like after everyone else goes to sleep. By the 4th night, everyone in my room was exhausted. We had to leave before sunrise the next morning, so my roommates were asleep before 10. I wasn't even tired. I sat outside our room scrolling through dating apps, mostly because I was bored. Eventually I started chatting with a girl who claimed she lived about 2 miles away. She suggested meeting for coffee at a 24-hour diner. Looking back now, I know how unbelievably stupid that was. I was underage. Alone. In a city I barely knew. And nobody from school had any idea where I was going. But at 17, bad ideas often sound exciting. I slipped out of the hotel carrying only my room key, wallet, and phone. Downtown Reno still had plenty of people walking around. Casinos glowed with flashing lights. Music drifted out of open doors. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt completely normal. As I kept walking, though, the streets slowly changed. The bright casinos disappeared behind me. The sidewalks became quieter. Closed storefronts replaced restaurants. A few people stood smoking outside old motels. Others sat alone at bus stops even though it was nearly midnight. The GPS eventually led me into an older neighborhood filled with small apartment buildings. The girl actually showed up. To my surprise, she was exactly who she claimed to be. We talked for a while, grabbed coffee, and everything about the meeting felt perfectly normal. Nothing strange happened. Around 1 in the morning, I started walking back toward the hotel. That's when things began going wrong. The temperature had dropped. A cold wind blew dust across the empty streets. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains, and within minutes it started raining. Not a heavy storm. Just enough to soak through my hoodie. The GPS suggested a different route back than the one I'd taken earlier. I figured it would be faster. After 20 minutes of walking, I realized I hadn't seen another pedestrian in several blocks. Streetlights became farther apart. Most businesses were closed. The only sounds were distant traffic and the rain hitting parked cars. Then my phone battery died. The screen went completely black. I actually laughed for a second because it felt too cliché. Then reality hit. I had absolutely no idea where I was. I looked around hoping something would seem familiar. Nothing did. Every street looked the same. I stood there for maybe a minute trying to remember the direction I'd come from before accepting that I was completely lost. Eventually I saw an older man walking his dog. I hurried over and explained that I was trying to get back to a hotel downtown. He looked at me for a moment before asking how old I was. When I said 17, he shook his head. You shouldn't be out here by yourself this late. I know. He pointed in the direction of downtown. I can walk you most of the way. I hesitated. Everything I'd ever been taught said not to follow strangers. At the same time, I had no phone, no map, and no clue where I was. So I accepted. The man turned out to be friendly. We talked about baseball, the weather, and how much Reno had changed over the years. He even insisted on walking me all the way back to the hotel instead of simply pointing me in the right direction. The whole time, I kept one hand inside my hoodie pocket where I was holding my room key. Not because I thought he was dangerous. Just because I didn't completely trust anyone. When we reached the hotel entrance, I thanked him several times. He smiled, wished me luck, and walked away into the rain. I felt relieved. The worst part of the night was finally over. Or at least. That's what I believed. I rode the elevator back upstairs, quietly unlocked our room, took a quick shower, plugged in my dead phone, and crawled into the bottom bunk without waking my roommates. Within minutes I was asleep. I don't know how long I had been sleeping before something bright hit my face. I opened my eyes. A flashlight was shining directly into them. Standing less than 2 feet away, was a man I had never seen before. For a second, I honestly thought I was still dreaming. The flashlight was so bright I couldn't even make out the man's face. I blinked several times before my eyes finally adjusted. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s. Dark jacket. Ball cap. Clean shaven. He wasn't wearing anything that looked like hotel staff clothing. He just stood there beside my bed holding the flashlight inches from my face. I shot upright so fast that I slammed my head against the bunk above me. "What are you doing?" I asked. My voice came out louder than I expected. One of my roommates shifted in his sleep but didn't wake up. The man didn't seem startled. He calmly lowered the flashlight and answered in a relaxed voice. "I'm helping your friend Tyler." I frowned. "What?" "He lost his student ID. I did have a friend named Tyler on the trip. He was the kind of guy who constantly misplaced things, so for half a second the explanation almost made sense. Almost. Then I remembered something. Tyler wasn't staying in our room. He was 2 floors above us with another group. So why are you in here? The man ignored the question. Instead, he walked over to the dresser and started opening drawers as if he belonged there. By now my heart was pounding again. I grabbed my phone from beside the bed. The battery had only charged a few percent, but it was enough to turn on the flashlight. I aimed it directly at him. What exactly are you looking for? Without even turning around, he answered. His ID. That made absolutely no sense. Why would Tyler's student ID be inside our dresser? Another student suddenly appeared in the doorway. He looked half asleep. Have you guys found Tyler's ID yet? The stranger immediately replied. Not yet. The student nodded like that was a perfectly normal answer before wandering back into the hallway. Apparently the same story had already been told in other rooms. My roommate Ethan finally woke up. What the hell's going on? I explained what the man had told me. Ethan looked confused but not alarmed. We were all exhausted. Our bus was leaving before sunrise. Nobody was thinking clearly. The stranger continued opening backpacks. Looking under beds. Checking inside closets. Almost casually. I watched him unzip another student's duffel bag. He wasn't searching carefully. He was digging. Looking through wallets. Moving clothes around. That's when something finally clicked in my brain. I stood up. Show me your hotel badge. He paused for the first time. I don't have one. Then why are you in our room? He smiled. Not a friendly smile. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. I'm just trying to help. Before I could say anything else, voices echoed from farther down the hallway. Teachers. Lots of them. Someone had apparently called one after waking up enough to realize the situation didn't make sense. The stranger looked toward the open door. Then back at me. Without another word, he calmly walked out. Not running. Not panicking. Just casually leaving the room. Seconds later our teacher rushed inside asking if everyone was okay. We told him what had happened. He immediately ran back into the hallway. The man was already gone. By morning, after everyone was fully awake, the whole story finally came together. 3 different students discovered their belongings missing. One had lost his wallet. Another's laptop had disappeared. Tyler's student ID really had been stolen. That's how the man knew his name. He'd taken the ID first, then walked room to room pretending he was helping find it. Because everyone was half asleep, nobody questioned why a complete stranger was searching through their luggage. He had simply used the stolen ID to make his story believable. Hotel management called the police almost immediately. Officers interviewed all of us before we were allowed to leave. The biggest mystery was how he had gotten inside. The hallway doors required room keys after midnight. Security cameras covered the lobby. Yet somehow he walked through multiple floors without anyone stopping him. One officer believed another guest had let him inside without realizing it. Another thought he may have slipped in behind a tour group earlier that evening and hidden somewhere until everyone went to sleep. Nobody knew for certain. Because of the investigation, our buses left almost 3 hours late. Tyler eventually received a replacement student ID. The others canceled their bank cards and replaced their stolen electronics through insurance. As for the man, the police never told us whether they identified him. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. Sometimes I wonder if he chose our room randomly. Other times I wonder if someone had followed me back after I wandered across Reno alone. Maybe he saw me enter the hotel. Maybe he waited for the right moment. Or maybe that's just my imagination trying to explain something that never really made sense. Either way, one thing still bothers me more than anything else. When I first opened my eyes, he wasn't searching through our bags. He was standing over me. Looking directly at my face. And I still have no idea how long he'd been there before I woke up. A few years later, 4 of my friends and I decided to take a road trip across northern Nevada. We wanted something different from the usual vacation. Instead of staying in Las Vegas the whole time, we planned to drive through Ely, Great Basin National Park, and several of the tiny desert towns that most tourists never even hear about. The scenery was incredible. Miles of empty highways. Old mining towns. Mountains rising out of endless desert. It honestly felt like another planet. We landed in Reno, rented an SUV, and started driving east. Since I was the only one over 25, the rental company required me to be the primary driver, so I ended up behind the wheel for almost the entire trip. It wasn't a problem. I actually enjoy long drives. The first few days went perfectly. By our 4th evening, we had nearly reached the small cabin we'd rented outside Ely. According to the GPS, we were less than 45 minutes away. The roads had become almost completely empty. Sometimes we drive 15 or 20 minutes without seeing another vehicle. It was close to midnight when everything changed. A pickup truck appeared behind us. At first, I barely noticed it. Then it started getting closer. Really close. The driver stayed only a few feet off my rear bumper. Every time I slowed down slightly, he slowed down. When I sped up, so did he. My friend Mason looked into the side mirror. That guy's way too close. I know. I figured he'd pass us eventually. Instead, he stayed glued behind us for another 10 miles. Then something strange happened. A massive light mounted above the truck's cab suddenly switched on. It flooded the entire inside of our SUV with bright white light. I could barely see the road. What the hell? Someone in the back seat covered their eyes. The light stayed on for nearly 30 seconds before finally shutting off. I pulled farther ahead. The truck didn't try to catch up immediately. It simply stayed behind us at the same distance. That's when I jokingly said, "Let's see if he follows us." Nobody laughed. We all had the same feeling. About 10 minutes later, instead of turning toward our cabin, I deliberately took a different road leading toward a small residential area. The truck followed. Every turn. Every stop sign. Every curve. No hesitation. Nobody spoke anymore. The atmosphere inside the SUV completely changed. One of my friends quietly pulled up the local sheriff's office number. Cell service was weak, but somehow the call connected. She explained that a truck had been following us for miles. The dispatcher asked where we were. None of us really knew. The GPS only showed tiny county roads with numbers instead of names. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line and head toward Ely instead of continuing into the mountains. She said deputies would meet us there. As we turned around, the pickup turned around too. That confirmed everything. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. The truck wanted us. About 15 minutes later we reached the outskirts of town. Streetlights finally appeared. Gas stations. Fast food restaurants. People. For the first time in nearly an hour, I felt like we weren't completely alone anymore. Then I looked into the mirror. Another pickup had joined behind the first one. Then a third. 3 trucks. Driving together. One directly behind another. Nobody inside our SUV said a word. We all watched them through the mirrors as they stayed together like they were traveling as a group. The dispatcher told us to continue toward the sheriff's office. So we did. The closer we got, the slower the trucks became. Almost like they already knew exactly where we were going. That thought made me even more nervous. Finally, the sheriff's office came into view at the end of the street. The parking lot was mostly empty. As I pulled in, the convoy split apart. One truck continued straight. The other 2 turned onto different side streets. They disappeared before we even stopped the SUV. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if we'd imagined the whole thing. Then a deputy stepped outside the building. And everything became real again. The deputy looked from our SUV to our faces and immediately knew something was wrong. My friend Ava was crying. Mason could barely sit still. I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands had gone numb. The deputy walked over to my window. "You folks the ones who called?" "Yeah." I pointed back toward the road. "They've been following us for almost an hour." He looked down the street, but by then the trucks had already disappeared. Another deputy came outside carrying a clipboard. They took our statements one at a time. I explained everything. The pickup riding my bumper. The floodlight. The turns through random streets. The second and third trucks joining behind the first. The deputies listened carefully but kept exchanging glances that I couldn't quite read. Finally, one of them sighed. "Stay here." He disappeared inside the building and returned a minute later driving a marked patrol SUV. "We'll escort you." It wasn't exactly what I'd hoped for. Part of me wanted them to go after the trucks immediately. Instead, they explained there wasn't much they could legally do. Nobody had threatened us. Nobody had hit our vehicle. Following another car, while creepy, wasn't necessarily a crime. Still, they agreed something about the situation didn't seem right. The deputy pulled onto the road ahead of us. We followed behind. For the first few miles, everything seemed normal. The highway was empty again. No headlights behind us. No pickups. I finally started relaxing. Maybe whoever they were had decided it wasn't worth the risk once they saw we'd gone to law enforcement. About 10 minutes later, the deputy suddenly slowed down. He picked up his radio. "What is it?" Mason asked. I looked into the rearview mirror. 3 pairs of headlights had appeared in the distance. Far back. But definitely there. The same spacing. The same formation. The trucks were back. The deputy must have noticed them too because he switched on his emergency lights. The 3 pickups reacted instantly. Instead of continuing toward us, all 3 turned onto separate dirt roads that branched off into the desert. Within seconds, they disappeared into the darkness. The deputy stopped his SUV. He stared toward the empty desert for a long moment before speaking into his radio. Eventually he turned back toward us. "They're gone." One of my friends asked if they were going after them. He shook his head. "There are hundreds of miles of ranch roads out there. By the time we find one, the others will be long gone." He escorted us the rest of the way to our cabin. Before leaving, he handed me a card with the sheriff's direct number. "If you see any of those trucks again, call immediately." We thanked him and unloaded our bags. The cabin sat completely alone on the edge of a valley. Earlier that day, we'd thought the isolation was beautiful. Now it felt unsettling. None of us wanted to admit it, but nobody slept particularly well that night. Every engine in the distance made someone peek through the curtains. Every set of headlights on the highway made us wonder if they had found us. Morning finally came. Sunlight made everything feel almost ridiculous. Like we'd exaggerated the whole experience. Until breakfast. We stopped at a small cafe in Ely before leaving town. As we were paying, Ava suddenly froze. She quietly whispered, "Don't turn around." Of course I turned around. Across the street, parked beside an old gas station, sat the same dark pickup that had started everything. The driver wasn't getting gas. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply sitting behind the wheel. Watching the cafe. Watching us. The moment our eyes met, he started the engine. Instead of driving toward us, he slowly pulled away and disappeared down the highway. That was the last time any of us ever saw him. To this day, none of us knows who those people were. Maybe they were just trying to scare tourists. Maybe they planned to rob us somewhere outside town. Maybe the other trucks belonged to friends they'd called after deciding to follow us. Whatever the reason, one thing has always stayed with me. If we hadn't decided to drive toward the sheriff's office, I honestly don't know where that convoy would have taken us. About a year after that road trip, my girlfriend Emily and I decided we needed a real vacation. We had both been working ridiculous hours in Las Vegas, and every weekend seemed to disappear before it even started. Instead of flying somewhere expensive, we rented a small house near Lake Tahoe on the Nevada side, hoping for 2 quiet weeks away from traffic, casinos, and work. The place looked incredible online. A modern cabin surrounded by pine trees. A large deck overlooking the mountains. Only a short drive from the lake. It felt like exactly what we needed. For almost 2 weeks, everything was perfect. We hiked during the mornings. We spent afternoons by the water. At night we'd sit outside watching the stars while the forest stayed almost completely silent. It was easily one of the best vacations either of us had ever taken. Until the last night. We decided to take one final walk before packing. The shoreline was almost empty. A cool breeze drifted across the lake, and the moon reflected off the water so brightly that we barely needed flashlights. We spread out a blanket near the beach and just sat there talking. Emily had no idea that I'd been carrying an engagement ring in my backpack for 3 days. I'd been waiting for the perfect moment. I finally reached into my pocket and started telling her everything I'd rehearsed in my head. How we'd met. How she'd changed my life. How I couldn't imagine a future without her. She smiled. Then her expression suddenly changed. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring over my shoulder. "There are people behind you." I turned around. About 30 feet away stood a man and a woman. Neither of them was doing anything. They were simply standing there. Facing us. At first I assumed they were another couple walking along the shore. Then they started walking directly toward us. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked away. The woman had long dark hair hanging over a gray sweatshirt. The man beside her wore a flannel shirt despite the warm evening and kept both hands inside his pockets. When they reached us, they stopped much closer than strangers normally would. They simply smiled. Emily finally broke the silence. "Can we help you?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "You two look happy." Her voice sounded calm. Almost friendly. "Thanks," Emily replied. "We're actually in the middle of something." The woman smiled even wider. "I know." The man still hadn't said a single word. He just stood there watching us. Something about the way he stared made every instinct in my body tell me to leave. Before either of us could say anything else, footsteps came from farther up the beach. Another man. Another woman. They walked directly over and joined the first two. Now there were 4 strangers standing around us. The second woman looked at the first and quietly laughed. "Oh. You found another couple." The sentence wasn't threatening. It wasn't shouted. But something about the way she said it made my stomach knot instantly. Emily slowly stood up. "I think we're leaving now." None of them moved. Instead, all 4 of them took one small step closer. One of the men's boots stopped right at the edge of our blanket. I stepped in front of Emily. "I'm serious. You need to back away." For several seconds nobody answered. Then, all 4 of them smiled at exactly the same time. And one of the men suddenly rushed toward me. The first shove knocked me backward before I even realized what was happening. I stumbled over the edge of our blanket and hit the rocky sand hard enough to knock the air out of my lungs. Before I could get back up, the second man rushed in. A fist caught the side of my face. Everything started ringing. Emily screamed my name. I saw her grab one of the men's arms, trying to pull him away from me, but one of the women shoved her so hard that she nearly fell into the shallow water. Neither woman tried to stop the fight. They just watched. Smiling. It wasn't loud laughter. It wasn't angry. It was quiet. Almost amused. That somehow made it even more disturbing. One of the men grabbed my jacket and yanked me halfway to my feet before throwing me back down. Pain shot through my ribs. As I rolled onto my side trying to breathe, I noticed the taller man reaching inside his flannel shirt. His hand disappeared beneath the fabric. Immediately my mind jumped to the worst possible conclusion. A knife. A gun. Something. I knew that if he pulled out a weapon, we had almost no chance. Everything after that happened in seconds. One of the women stepped closer, close enough that her foot was only inches from mine. Without thinking, I kicked as hard as I could. She lost her balance and crashed into the second woman. For one brief moment. Every single one of them looked away from me. That was all I needed. I grabbed Emily's hand. Run. We sprinted across the beach toward the parking area. The uneven ground made every step difficult. Loose rocks slid beneath our shoes. My ribs felt like they were on fire. Blood dripped from somewhere above my eye. I didn't dare look back. I could hear footsteps behind us. Then shouting. Then nothing but our own breathing. We reached the parking lot, jumped into the rental SUV, locked every door, and I started the engine with shaking hands. Emily kept looking through the rear window. Go. I didn't wait. The tires threw gravel everywhere as we sped out of the lot. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel. When we finally reached the cabin, we locked every window and every door. I checked them twice. Then a third time. Neither of us slept. Every sound outside made us freeze. Wind through the trees. Branches scraping the deck. Cars passing on the highway miles away. Everything sounded like footsteps. Before sunrise we packed everything. Originally we had planned to stay one more day before driving back to Las Vegas. Instead, we checked out as soon as we could. While loading the SUV, I kept scanning the road. Every passing vehicle made my heart race. As we pulled away from the cabin and reached the main road, Emily suddenly grabbed my arm. There. Standing beside a scenic overlook were the same two women. They were alone this time. At least. I only saw the two of them. For one hopeful second I thought they hadn't noticed us. Then our SUV rolled closer. Both women slowly turned toward the road. Their faces lit up with those exact same smiles. One of them calmly raised her hand and waved. Not sarcastically. Not angrily. Almost warmly. Like we were old friends saying goodbye after a pleasant visit. Neither of us waved back. I pressed harder on the accelerator and kept driving until the mountains disappeared behind us. Later that afternoon, after we reached Carson City, we finally reported everything to local police. An officer took our statements and said they'd checked the area around the beach. We never heard another word. No arrests. No follow-up. Nothing. A few months later, I finally proposed to Emily. Not beside a lake. Not during a vacation. Just at home with both of our families there. She said yes. Sometimes people ask why I never plan romantic surprises while traveling anymore. I usually laugh and change the subject. The truth is simple. Some memories ruin a place forever. Whenever I think about Lake Tahoe now, I don't remember the mountains. I don't remember the sunsets. I remember four strangers smiling in complete silence. And walking toward us together.